So I want to thank Dr. Ryken for the many things he did behind the scenes to help, and also thank you for your prayer. I've been astounded to hear how many people actually prayed for me here, not only in chapels, but in your, just personally. And I'm very grateful for that. There was a great tsunami wave of prayer that crashed into that land. I wrote a wave of prayer out of there, but there was a great tsunami wave of prayer that crashed into Turkey, and it's going to change Turkey and the region. And someday you will see that you were actually part of a huge move of God that was going on. It was much bigger than just our being released. Around 12 years ago, I began to run after God in a different way. I'd been in ministry for a number of years already, but I became hungry for more. And I can assure you that no matter how far along you are in your walk with God, there is always more. There's always more. And I became very, very hungry for more of God. And I began to really pray for intimacy and to go after presence. When I talk about presence, I just want to give you this background so you can understand later how this affected me in prison. There are different levels and degrees in which God shows his presence. In one sense, we say God is omnipresent and he's everywhere. And there's a different sense. Jesus said, where two or three are gathered together in my name, I am there. So God is present where two or three of us gather together in a small group. He's different in a different way in my life through Holy Spirit, and that he lives in me. But there are also times when he manifests his presence in a way that's sensible to us. I think of one example at the dedication of Solomon's temple, when the presence of God descended like a cloud, and it was so strong, so powerful that the priests could not stand in the temple. So we began to spend a lot of time just seeking God. I wanted to become hungry, to become thirsty for him. And as we persisted, then he started showing up more, you could say, started demonstrating his presence more. And I began to hunger to experience God's glory, to just taste his presence in a different way than I had before. And God began to give signs of his presence. We had healings. We began to hear his voice. There were dreams. Many people had dreams, visions. And there was often just a sense in our meetings of his presence. So we set pursuing intimacy with God as our main value, hearing his voice and seeking his presence and learning to live as sons and daughters of the Father. And yes, we were involved in church planning. We worked with refugees. We had a house of prayer. There were a number of things that we were doing in ministry, but in all of them, our main goal in all of the things we did was the same. We want intimacy. We want to love God in a deeper way and experience him. Not in my imprisonment. Some people have told me, God loved you so much, he kept you in prison for 2 years where you could just be alone with him. Just you and God. It sounds wonderful, doesn't it? Just 2 years with God. So let me tell you what happened. So Noreen and I were arrested. We were for deportation. We were held together for 2 weeks. And after this, she was released. But the Turkish government continued to hold me. They kept me in solitary confinement. I was very afraid. I knew there was a powerful spirit behind this arrest, and I didn't know when I would be released. And I was alone. I was locked in a room. No books, no paper, no pen, nothing. No contact with anyone other than guards. And it was just me in a bed. I didn't even have a chair. And that first week in solitary confinement, I did have a sense of God's presence. I was afraid, but at the same time, I drew some comfort from the sense of his being near me. I could sense that he was with me, I sense that presence. And I thought at the time, if I get out of here and I write a book, I'd like to title it Presence, the Fundamental Need. And then, over a few days, I completely lost the sense of God's presence. God was silent. And he remained silent for 2 years. I was desperate for his touch, but I had no sense of his presence. And I don't mean emotions. I mean every way in which I'd sensed him in the past, in my spirit, physically, just the awareness of God. And I didn't see any evidence of his presence. He didn't give any signs in any way. And I cried out in anguish, but it was like talking to a wall, calling out to a wall. It was just silence. and I felt completely abandoned. And this terrible silence and isolation continued throughout the rest of my imprisonment. I was very surprised. I hadn't expected that. And remember, I'd been running after presence for 10 years at that time. Then I was transferred to a high security prison. I was kept in a cell with 20 strong Muslims. And they could not understand my anguish, my doubts, my cries to God. And this is because I have a very different expectation for my relationship with God. You know, God describes himself as a father, and I'm his son. He also describes himself as a jealous husband, and I'm the object of his passion, the bride. So what kind of a father, if his son is crying out for him, remains silent? If my son is calling out, Dad, I would at least answer him, I'm here, Jordan, I'm here, Blaze. Or my wife, if Noreen were in pain and crying out, there's nothing that moves me more than that, would I remain silent? So I had the expectation of a son. I had the expectation of a beloved bride, and I couldn't understand the distance and the silence of my beloved. And my great grief came from being separated from Noreen. She's my closest friend. And from my children, I was afraid that I would not see my children again. And I wept bitterly. But this was not the cause for the crisis of faith I was having. I don't like persecution. I don't understand why God doesn't intervene more forcefully, more often, sometimes. But I do understand it's a possibility for God's children. Jesus said it would happen. The crisis, what broke my heart towards God, was feeling abandoned by him. And I became so weary, so tired of fighting. I wanted to be done. I just wanted to go to heaven. I would much rather be in heaven than spend years in a Turkish prison. And I called out and I accused God. Now, when I'm in the valley of death, in my desperation, in the darkest time of my life, and I'm suffering, let me remind you, God, I'm suffering because of Jesus. Where are you now? What kind of father are you? What kind of lover are you? You know, God says that he'll never leave us or forsake us. He doesn't say that he will give us a sense of his presence or that he'll give signs of his presence. And I was not prepared for what I faced. I thought I was relatively tough. I'd been 23 years in Turkey. If you want to be popular, probably the best thing, you don't want to become a church planter in a Muslim country if you want to be popular. So we had gone through difficulties. I'd placed myself in danger. I was shot at once. We experienced betrayals. The Turkish government tore down our house. Noreen and I spent time near a war zone. So I thought, you know, I've endured for 23 years. I'm pretty strong. But prison was beyond my strength. I was thoroughly broken. God brought me through. The first year especially, I was broken. The second year, he began to rebuild me. And I want to focus on one of the things that I learned. For me in prison, the fundamental thing, I had thought it would be presence because that's what I'd run after for years, and I love presence. I'm running after presence again now. The most necessary thing was not a sense of God's presence. The most necessary fundamental thing I learned was a simple devotion, a simple faithfulness, a simple love on my part. And I was stripped of brothers and sisters, of fellowship. I was the only believer Christian for 2 years, and very little contact. The only contact I had with another believer was with Noreen, who could begin to visit me once a week. So I was stripped of that sense of the warmth of God's presence as well, and what was left was a core of love in my heart, a simple devotion that I clung to in desperation. The prison biographies I had read did not prepare me for the struggle I faced in prison. In fact, I had an idealized, romantic view of suffering from persecution. I expected, yes, it may be difficult, it's going to be hard, but I'm going to be filled with joy. I'm going to be like Paul and Silas, you know, they're in prison and yet they're singing. And then I thought, wait, they only spent a day in prison. So I expected that I'd be filled with joy. I knew it would be hard, but I expected that I'd have some sense of real strength in me. Yes, I'd have grief, but a sense of grace. And I've read of prisoners who've had encounters with Jesus, who encounter Jesus in prison. They have angels show up. They have visions. They hear the audible voice of God. Some of them, I didn't. But what I heard after I got out of prison is that many people have had a similar experience to mine. They occasionally have a bit of light, but it's rare. And most of the time they experience the silence of God and have a sense of abandonment. And it doesn't only happen in instances of persecution. I was recently talking with a pastor whose wife spent close to 4 years in bed after a routine and simple surgery went wrong. And during those 4 years, his wife had no sense of God's presence. And she wanted to die. She felt abandoned by God. And there are many examples we could give. You say, why? Why? Where is the lover of my soul in the dark night? Why? Although he's present, because I know he's present. Why doesn't he give me, why does he keep me from sensing his presence? Where is the comfort? Where are the loving arms? I don't know. I don't know. And that's my question. Why? Where are you? That's my question. But God also has a question for me. Will you be offended? Andrew, will you continue to love me? Will you still devote your heart to me? Will you pass the test? And this is the truth. God tests his sons and daughters. I'm not saying God causes evil. I'm not saying he's the source for all of our hardships. But in the midst of hardships, he tests us. And God gives difficult assignments to his children. And the more difficult assignment he's going to give you, the more you want from him, the more you will be tested to prepare you for those assignments. These can be painful. They can stretch us beyond what we would have expected. Think of the people, just for 5 seconds, the people you most admire in the Bible. What are some of the names that come to your mind? Some on my list, I think Abraham, Moses, I really admire Moses, David, Joseph. And now think what they went through. I don't have time to go into their tests, but just think, these are God's friends. And look how he treated them. Almost all of God's friends have a time of testing when answers were delayed, or they felt abandoned, or they experienced God's silence. And when God took them into that testing, he knew they would be stretched. He knew it would be hard for them. He knew it would be painful, and he took them into it anyway. And they made it through. They were faithful. They didn't turn away in offense. And they emerged from the testing as proven and as friends of God. There are many who go into the valley of testing, and you will go into the valley of testing. There are many who go into the valley of testing, and some do not make it out. Some do not survive. It's not automatic. The valley of testing is full of dry bones. And I've seen many people knocked out of ministry. And I've seen many believers in different walks of life who are knocked out of their friendship with God. And they may end up in heaven, but they miss out on the victories that God intended to win through them. They miss out, they lose the inheritance that God intended them to gain. There's an intimacy, there's a depth of friendship that only comes with testing. Untested love, untested devotion, untested loyalty is unproven. It may be real and it may be completely genuine, but it's not proven. You think of soldiers, they train for battle, but until they've been in battle, there's something that's missing. And a gift that God gave me, a result of my testing, is that he showed me my heart. Usually when we talk about God showing us our heart, we think it's all sin. But there are some very good things that God builds in our hearts. After 18 months in prison, the Turkish government finally decided to put me on trial. And a day before the trial, I was suddenly moved back to my old prison where the trial would take place. And this was very, very difficult for me. I'd experienced a lot of trauma at Shakram prison. So when they returned me there, it just triggered all of that trauma again. And I was put into a solitary cell. Next to me were the generals who had been involved in a coup in Turkey. And on my trial day, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept for 2 days. I hadn't eaten. By that time, I had started to take anti-anxiety meds, and my body had become dependent on them. And I stood alone. I didn't have my anxiety medication. They hadn't given it to me. And I stood alone, tired. I hadn't eaten. I was weak. And I stood alone in court for a 13-hour session. Add to this the terrible stress. I was falsely accused of terror crimes and spying. I knew this was a completely political case. I knew that the judges did not care about truth at all. And they were asking for 35 years. And I was told that I'd be kept in solitary confinement and this traumatic prison for the duration of the trial, and that trial I knew could go on for 2 or 3 years. So I was devastated, physically and emotionally. I was broken, and I lay there alone in my solitary cell, just isolated. I had great fear. I had terrible grief welling up inside of me, and I was weeping. And the prayer keeps going through my mind. Where are you, God? Why have you permitted them to return me to this awful place? How many times will you let me be crushed? Why haven't you intervened for me? Why are you so far away, so silent? I just grieving, weeping. And I opened my mouth, I'm weeping aloud, and I was surprised by what I heard coming out of my mouth. I was saying, I love you, Jesus. I love you, Jesus. I love you, Jesus. And I thought, here is my victory. Yes, I do love you. Even if you're silent, I love you. Even if you don't give me your presence, I love you. Even if you let my enemy harm me, I love you. And somebody told me, Andrew, you passed the test of betrayal. You didn't betray Jesus. I questioned God. But God's faithfulness and loyalty and love was not being tested. They never are. My faithfulness, my love, my loyalty was being tested. Would I pass the test of silence? Would I betray when I felt betrayed? There's a test of isolation, the test of abandonment, of being alone with no support, the test of unfelt grace, of weakness, of brokenness, the test of doubts. I have proved my love for God. Yes, I was weak and broken. Without His grace, I would not have made it through. But during my worst times, when I felt abandoned, alone, when God was silent, I cried out, I love you, Jesus. And this is precious. It's precious to God. God may have known what the result would be, that I would remain faithful, that I would love Him. But until I actually went through the test, through that hardship, until I passed that test, I had not proven that. So my test and my victory, it's precious to God. It's also precious to me because He showed me my heart, and now I know. And I know that He knows. And that gives me a confidence in my relationship with God. It was costly, but I've gained a new measure of intimacy with Him. And I know that Jesus trusts me at a different level now. My tests aren't over, and they'll go on until I get to heaven. But you will also have tests. Tests are coming your way. And I'm sure some of you are experiencing hardship. If you haven't, you will. But some of you even now are experiencing hardship. Maybe an illness or a problem in your family, something bad has happened to you, and the hardships you go through, they will test your devotion to God. And you may be wondering, where is my God? Where are you, Jesus? Where's my shepherd? Where's the lover of my soul? God, why are you silent during my most difficult hour? Why have you not intervened? I went through a crisis of faith my third year at Wheaton. Many people doing there, especially the third and fourth year. Maybe you're going through that. Maybe you have a lot of questions now. And this is agonizing. It's painful. And I don't know the answers. And it doesn't matter. The answers don't really matter, because you must survive the test. Even if you don't get the answers, you must survive the test. Don't lose your battle in the valley. You must not become offended at God. And if you are offended, then you must not stay offended. You must hold on to him. You have to connect your heart to him. The cry of your heart has to be, in the end, at its most basic, Jesus, I love you. I love you even in your silence. I love you even in my isolation. I love you even in the dark, in the darkness. And I have a sense of urgency for you. I have a sense of urgency for your generation. I believe it's going to become more and more costly to stand for Jesus. And in the United States, it may not mean prison at this time, but it can be being marginalized, being shamed publicly, maybe losing a job. All that comes from being shamed publicly. And evil and darkness is increasing. And it's going to become more intense, and I don't mean to just bring doom and gloom, because I don't look at it that way. I think things are going to become more difficult, but I think the Bible also shows that the glory of God is going to be poured out on his people, on his children. We're going to carry an authority that's going to draw, and a glory that's going to draw people to the Lord. So evil and darkness is increasing. It's going to become more intense, and this should not surprise us, because Jesus clearly warned that as his return draws near, this is going to happen. And God is also going to move powerfully, but it's going to be in difficult circumstances. And my urgency comes from thinking that many of us are not prepared for this. Are you prepared? Is your heart ready to stand in difficulty? If you don't have the right mentality, if you're not prepared, if your heart isn't ready, then it will surprise you. And this is dangerous. Jesus warned that many, if you're surprised, if your heart isn't ready, Jesus warned that many will fall prey to fear. They'll be driven by fear. They'll make decisions out of fear. Many will be deceived. Many will fall into immorality and into drunkenness. I'm not saying this. Jesus said this, and I'm sure all kinds of drugs. Jesus is the one who said this. And they'll do this to self-medicate as a means to escape. And many are going to be offended. Many will be offended at what God allows to happen, that God doesn't intervene. They'll blame him for many things, and they'll turn away. Their heart will grow cold. Their love will grow cold. And many believers will be offended when in the darkness they think, God has abandoned me. And they'll be so disappointed that their heart will become cold. This is my urgency for you. Make a decision now that this will not be you. Now is a time to cultivate a simple devotion to God that will enable you to stand in the most difficult times. And it's not automatic. It's a decision that you make. Am I going to love God? Am I going to be devoted to him? My time is up. I want to leave you with that thought. Cultivate devotion, a simple devotion to Jesus. Make a decision today that you will get up every day and say, my goal in life is to love you, God. Prepare your heart to be loyal, to love him even in the hardest times. I want to pray for you. Maybe you can, in your heart, pray along with me. Because I think that some of you are walking in darkness now, and you think, where is my God? And there are some of you who are offended at God, and your heart has grown cold. And probably everyone here just needs to renew. You need to renew your love for God. I have to do this every day. I do it every day. I say, God, I just want to love you with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength. I want to love you with everything I have. So I invite you to do what I do for myself. Renew your love for Jesus. Some of you do not have a committed love for Jesus. You don't have it yet. Take that step. Renew your simple devotion to God. It's a choice. Oh, Father, I want to be yours. I want to be a faithful son. I want to love you. I want to love Jesus with all I have. So capture my heart. I don't want to be offended by what I don't understand. For you who are struggling, just say, here is my wounded, broken heart. I look to the lover of my soul. Oh God, let your Holy Spirit come into this place. Let your winds blow and kindle a love for Jesus that will burn bright and will take my brothers and sisters through the darkest night. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.